Good evening and welcome, and thank you very much for being here on a Friday evening in what is in effect prime time, as it were. I'm Sunil Khilnani. I'm the Dean of Ashoka X, which is the online platform of Ashoka University. And I'll be hosting this evening's Beyond the Classroom session, which is free and open to all, and which we hope will be a way to kind of pique your interest and whet your appetite to find out more about Ashoka X and all of the range of online teaching and learning that we offer. You'll find details of that on our website. Let me introduce our speaker for this evening, who unusually for these COVID times is actually sitting beside me here in Washington. In fact, I'm in his offices in Washington at New America, the think tank. Peter Bergen is a journalist, a scholar, an author, a filmmaker. He's vice president of New America, one of the country's leading and most innovative think tanks. He's a professor and a director of the study of the future of war at Arizona State University. He's a policy advisor and a mentor. And over the past 2 years, he's also been running the very widely read Coronavirus Daily Briefing, which has become an indispensable tracker for the pandemic. So whether it's to do with terrorism and national security or with the coronavirus and public health, Peter has always been in pursuit of truth, of facts, across fields and topics of great urgent global importance, yet fields and topics which are blurry with secrecy, rumor, conspiracy, and disinformation. And he pursues these difficult paths of knowledge without a trace of self-congratulation. He's immensely generous with his hard-won knowledge, and he's also remarkably modest. And though he's often put himself at risk in his own work, his stance is never a heroic one. Rather, he sees himself as part of a collective enterprise where each of us has to keep the other honest in pursuit of the fullest and best knowledge we can have about difficult subjects. So I think you'll understand why, when I say I'm especially pleased that we can launch this new series of Ashoka X's Beyond the Classroom conversations and launch it with Peter, I'm doing more than merely mouthing the customary introductory warm air. Peter really does embody the ethos and approach of Ashoka University and of Ashoka X, which is to work to create new knowledge about urgent issues through research and investigation, and then to take that knowledge to wider audiences, to help us improve the quality of public argument and collective decision-making. The way we'll be running this evening is that Peter and I will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions from all of you participants in this session. So please write your questions in the chat box, and we'll then pick those up and I'll read them and invite Peter to respond. And we'll aim to end the session at 9:30 this evening. So let's dive straight in. Peter, this has been a season of anniversaries and commemorations and remembrances of what happened on 9/11. And I wanted to ask you, amidst all of this, what's the one thing that you think we're still getting wrong? What's the one thing that still frustrates you about us not really having understood what happened that day?
You know, I don't think there's any one sort of particular thing, but I think that a lot of unexpected things flow from 9/11. You know, the United States obviously invaded Afghanistan, overthrew the Taliban on our back. That's unexpected. Invaded, occupied Iraq, precipitating sectarian civil war that's built into Syria, still going on. Conducted various kinds of military operations in Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, Libya. None of this, none of this was expected. And as a result, 7,000 American servicemen and women have been killed. Tens of thousands of American allies, soldiers have been killed, and hundreds of thousands of other people around the world in these conflicts have been killed. So, you know, something about that didn't go well. I mean, so in terms of what we got wrong, you know, we got a lot of things right, in my view. You know, in Afghanistan, there were a lot of advances, and we can talk about it in more detail later, but really an independent media being created. A whole generation that grew up with the chance of real education and jobs. Now that is all very much at risk. You know, but balanced against that, the original sin in the Middle East is the Iraq War, which really could not have happened without 9/11. The politics around it could not have allowed it to happen. And I think without that war, what's the biggest change since 9/11? I think for me is sectarianism, because bin Laden really wasn't interested in the sectarian conflict, while it's always existed, and clearly Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states have sort of fomented it, it was the Iraq War really set it all in motion and created Al-Qaeda in Iraq, created ISIS ultimately, which was instrumental in sort of deepening the sectarian civil war in Syria and in Iran and Iraq. And now we've seen it spill into Yemen. And just in the last day, we've seen this major attack on a Shia mosque in northern Afghanistan, where dozens of people have been killed. And that is sort of a new phenomenon. So what did we get wrong? One thing that we may not have understood is that sectarianism was really going to be a defining issue of the post 9/11 era. That was very unexpected, I think.
Yeah, and just drawing from that, I mean, do you think we are today, 20 years on, safer from the reach of global terrorism? And if so,
Yeah.
why? Or if we're not, why are we not?
Well, let's look at India for a minute. I mean, one thing that is interesting is on some levels is the lack of domestic Islamist terrorism in India, given the size of the population, the fact that they're somewhat marginalized, the fact that you have this Modi government, which is sort of Hindu nationalist in flavor. I mean, but we did of course see the Taj attack and the sort of complex attacks in Mumbai. They were carried out by Lashkar-e-Taiba, a group that has a real presence not just in Pakistan but also in Afghanistan. In fact, Lashkar-e-Taiba, as I understand it, was really an outgrowth of the Afghan war against the Soviets, and sort of formed in Pakistan after that war ended in 1989. So is India safer from terrorism now? I think the short answer is probably not, because you've got 20 terrorist groups in Afghanistan already, jihadi terrorist groups. Then we're sitting here in Washington, D.C. Is the United States safer? We're safer because we're protected by two very big oceans. So it's hard to get here. There are a lot of defensive measures that weren't in place on 9/11. But does that mean an American target in South Asia? It's not. That's very possible for one of these groups. Does it mean that Europeans might travel to Afghanistan to get training, do something like we saw in Paris in 2015 with ISIS, where they killed 130 people? So that's my concern. I don't think. I mean, I'll give you one final thought here. The new Minister of the Interior for the Taliban is Siraj Haqqani. The Minister of the Interior is, it's like, I'm not quite sure what the Indian equivalent would be, but in the United States, it's like running the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. Now he, according to the United Nations, is on the Leadership Council of Al-Qaeda. So now, for the first time in history, we have an Al-Qaeda member in a cabinet position. I mean, it's so I don't think that makes us safer. These things take a long time to develop. It might be 2 or 3 years from now that something develops. So you could see an attack in Europe with people trained in Afghanistan. You could see an attack in the region against an American target. You could see other attacks against enemies of these jihadist groups, which include India. And
in your view, was this direction in which things were going, in a sense, inevitable? Or do you think the withdrawal from Afghanistan has actually really taken a lid off and accelerated these potential trends?
I think it took a lid off because, President Obama went through the same processes that President Trump did and President Biden did. I mean, really, Biden and Trump share equal sort of blame for what had happened, because Obama had a fairly lengthy discussion of what to do about Afghanistan in the last 2 years of his second term. And he wanted to go to zero. Susan Rice, his national security advisor, said, that they were certainly considering it. But when they looked at it, after some debate, they left 8,400 troops there. Trump comes into office, H.R. McMaster is the national security advisor, the number of troops goes up to 14,000, and then it sort of was gradually pulled down to 2,500, 3,500. And there was this disastrous peace negotiation with the Taliban, in which the Taliban really didn't abide by any of its real terms. And Biden has said that he felt bound by the Trump peace agreement with the Taliban. I think that is not true. He wasn't bound by it. It was an agreement that they were not abiding by. leaving Al-Qaeda, having a real peace negotiation with the Afghan government. And it's an agreement with a terrorist insurgent group. It's not like a ratified treaty with a nation state. It's not even like the Iran nuclear deal, which was negotiated with a sovereign state that was abiding by the terms of the nuclear agreement. And that was negotiated with the America's closest allies, the British, the French, and the Germans. And Trump felt no compunction about tearing that up and pulling out. So, you know, I think Biden really just wanted to do this. It wasn't that he felt bound by the agreement. That was a kind of convenient fiction.
I mean, in the sort of debacle that Afghanistan has been since the withdrawal, in prospect, of course, there was this great confidence that the government was going to hold, the government forces were going to maintain the sovereignty of that state. And of course, that evaporated entirely in no time at all. Was it just a failure of intelligence, both military and in terms of the security apparatus, or were these things known and nevertheless they just kind of went on because, as you said, Biden had more or less taken this decision?
You know, the oldest dodge in Washington is to blame a policy failure on an intelligence failure. I mean, it's very convenient. Actually, the intelligence community did a rather good job of predicting. They predicted that, you know, a total U.S. pullout would result in the collapse of the Afghan government in 30 to 90 days. It took 11 days instead. I mean, what's the difference really? So the intelligence community certainly was, and it's always been very skeptical about what was going on in Afghanistan, took a much more skeptical view from the US military traditionally. You know, the problem about pulling out the 2,500 to 3,500 American troops that were there was that, and then all the NATO troops left, of which there were 7,000. Then all the contractors left, of which there were 16,000, 6,000 of them American. Those contractors were keeping the Afghan Air Force up in the air. And without the Afghan Air Force, you don't have medevac, you don't have close air support. I mean, you know, there was a narrative in Washington that the Afghan security forces performed very badly. Well, that's not really completely the whole story, because 66,000 of them were killed compared to, you know, 2,400 American soldiers in the course of the whole war. So, you know, they fought bravely, but they saw which way the wind was going. Once they didn't have kind of the Afghan Air Force to help them, and once all the Americans were gone and all the NATO forces were gone, they surrendered. And you know, as you know, the Afghan war began not when the Soviets invaded, but in 1978, when there was a communist coup, and that was the beginning of the Civil War. And there's been various iterations of the Civil War now for 43 years. So I'm 58. You know, if you're somebody in my position, throughout your entire adult life, essentially, there's been this war. And so it's not that Afghans are quite willing to fight, but they're not willing to have, you know, die in a cause that is, you know, President Ghani left the country. So there was a collapse of morale, and it was a psychological collapse, and it led to everything that we've come to now. And
this was kind of visible to not just to the intelligence community, but also to informed commentators from outside.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was I work at CNN, and you know, you're reluctant to make predictions, or at least I am, because, you know, I think making predictions is, you know, they can often be wrong. But as soon as I saw that Kunduz had fallen, and Kunduz is the main city on the Kabul to Kandahar road, and we were talking about these estimates about 30 to 90 days for the government to fall. I said, these estimates need to be revised. This is new information. The government's going to fall in a few days. And I think it fell 3 days later, or even 2 days later, because once the Taliban had cut off Kabul's the main city, Kandahar's the second main city. Once you cut them off from each other, I mean, the game is over. And so you didn't need any specialized classified information. You just needed to look at what was going on the ground And you know, so many. I mean, I think this is the biggest American foreign policy failure in decades, and there's a lot of blame to go around, including to the Afghans. I mean, it's not just the Afghan government. It's not just an American failure. But I mean, just to end on a slightly more positive note, I think the Taliban are going to do a number of things that are going to get them in trouble, and that are going to change the situation. So you may recall before 9/11, Sunil, that the Taliban forced the tiny Hindu minority in Afghanistan to wear distinctive clothing.
Right. Yeah.
You know, it's a small but rather telling point. I mean, the Hindu population of Afghanistan at the time was maybe 1,000. So, they're going to engage in ethnic cleansing. They're going to kill, they or their jihadi allies will kill an American or dual nationals. They'll allow these groups to regroup. They may carry out attacks in the region. They may carry out attacks in Europe. And the politics rules change. I mean, we saw that with Obama in Iraq. Joe Biden and Tony Blinken negotiated the total US withdrawal from Iraq. Once the ISIS was threatening to commit genocide against the Yazidis, once ISIS killed Jim Foley, the American journalist, the politics completely changed. And also, and the anti-ISIS coalition grew to several dozen countries because these ISIS threatened lots of countries. It wasn't just the United States. And they also threatened every ethnic and sectarian group that wasn't sort of on their side. And I think the Taliban, look at the makeup of the Taliban cabinet, it's sort of 95% Pashtun, and the population is really 40% Pashtun. They added a few token people from in very minor positions in the second round of cabinet appointments. So I don't think this is forever, because I think sort of embedded in the Taliban's DNA is they're going to make mistakes.
So I want to come back to those larger questions in a moment.
Yeah.
But the book that you've just published is, in a sense, the most full biography we have of Osama bin Laden, a man who you describe as single-handedly having changed the course of history.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, you mentioned in your book, you quote Bismarck's famous line on Napoleon as being a sphinx without a riddle.
Yeah.
And now you first encountered Osama bin Laden in the late 90s.
Yeah.
When you were part of the team interviewing him for CNN, and then you also walked through his compound in Abbottabad after he'd been shot and killed.
Yeah.
Got a sense of where he'd been living in the last years of his life. And you've also trolled through about 500,000 files and documents and interviews that you've made with people who knew him well.
Yeah.
How has your own understanding of this Sphinx, or perhaps not Sphinx, how has your own understanding evolved of this man?
This is a very interesting question. Because the why questions are much harder than the how questions, and I do a lot of explication of how he developed, and I think part of my as I was writing the book, I felt none of this was inevitable. We know from our own lives that outside forces intervene, they change things. He had a set of pretty bad cards at birth, or when he was a young man. He had one very good card, which he was born into this very rich family, but his parents divorced when he was 2. His father died when he was 10. He barely knew his father. By his own account, he only saw his father 5 times. Now, his father had 54 other kids, so he was also running a huge business, and he was a busy guy. The father died in a plane crash when bin Laden was 10. So by bin Laden's own account, he then turned to religion. He was very upset by his father's death, even though he barely knew him. And he studied the Quran, and he memorized the entire Quran. He was a very devout teenager. Now, what's also interesting, of course, he has 54 half brothers and half sisters, none of whom chose this path. So, I mean, one of the kind of, I don't do a lot of armchair psychologizing, and I don't tell the reader what to think. Mostly let him or her decide for themselves. But I do think that there was nothing inevitable. This religious teenager could have gone on to work in the family business and lived a quiet life. But the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, this galvanized him, and suddenly he's traveling to Pakistan, raising money, giving it to the Afghan freedom fighters. Then he goes into Afghanistan himself in 1984. He sets up a base called Al-Qaeda, the base in Arabic, in 1987. He starts fighting the Soviets personally. Out of this Al-Qaeda base becomes Al-Qaeda, the organization. And each step of the way, there were people trying to persuade him not to do this, or his family members, his friends. He had no military experience. He was setting up a military base, fighting the Soviets. It was very dangerous. So it was a long process of radicalization. I think there is a sort of philosophical question to consider, which I didn't get into in the book, which is around the nature of evil. Because Ron Rosenbaum, the New Yorker writer, wrote a whole book I think it was called Explaining Hitler. And it was really about the various explanations that people have produced. But at the end, you get to a kind of brick wall, which is, okay, I can tell you all these things about, but still setting up an organization to businesses that kill, innocent civilians and thousands of them, that's hard to completely answer. But my book is an attempt to answer it. But there reaches a point where other people are not completely knowable.
I mean, it's interesting this question of evil, really. I mean, one of the things that you bring out in your book is that actually Osama bin Laden, even as he was encouraging these acts of extreme violence and terror on people, there was still some sort of a sense of code of honor almost, which he seemed to operate by, in the sense that he was critical of more extremist sectarian groups that were even more horrific in the methods they were using. Yeah, I just wondered. I mean, can one discriminate between these kinds of actors? I talked to. There were two people that I talked to in the course of reporting the book that had the best explanations for bin Laden. One was his brother-in-law, Jamal Khalifa, who was his best friend at university, who was killed in mysterious circumstances in Madagascar in 2007. Potentially by the Americans, but we don't really know. It looked like a home invasion. Anyway, but Jamal, who married one of bin Laden's half-sisters, who was very religiously observant. Jamal was a very religiously observant friend of bin Laden's, and he tried to persuade bin Laden not to set up this military organization in Afghanistan because he told him, look, you have no military experience. But he also said that bin Laden really believed that God was on his side, and he was doing God's will, and that if he didn't do the things he did, God would punish him. This is his best friend and his brother-in-law. So I thought, okay, if anybody has an explanation, this is one of them. Then another guy who's now based in London, who was running the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and has now kind of rejected all this jihadism. There's a guy called Noman Ben-Oman, and he said that bin Laden had this very specific view that no one had immunity in his holy war, even except very Orthodox Muslims. And this view was confirmed to me by a memoir that one of bin Laden's bodyguards wrote. One of the reasons I wrote the book is it's not just the documents in Abbottabad, Pakistan, but so many more memoirs and documents have come out that help you illuminate the question. And Abu Jandal was bin Laden's bodyguard at Yemeni, and he asked bin Laden after the embassy attacks in Africa, which killed 212 people, why did you kill so many civilians? And bin Laden said, well, we warned them, given the interviews to CNN, ABC News. So in his view, because he had given these warnings that he was going to attack an American target, if you were near one, that was your problem. And then Abu Jandal followed up and said, well, what about the Muslim civilians that were also killed? Because he knew that Kenya is full of Muslims, and so is Tanzania. And bin Laden said, well, we set the bomb so it would go off at 10:30 on a Friday morning. And if you were an observant Muslim, you should have been at the mosque. So anybody who was out on the street was sort of that problem. So, but you're right. ISIS is an even more extreme example because bin Laden certainly wasn't interested in kind of creating a sectarian civil war in the Middle East. He went out of his way to really try and prevent that. And we now know for a fact, which has only really become clear relatively recently, but his mother is an Alawite, which we'd already suspected because she comes from Latakia in Syria, which is a very Alawite city. But if you're an Alawite, as I understand it, and actually understanding Alawism is not, it's a very obscure religion. They celebrate Christian and Muslim holidays. It's regarded as a heretical form of Shiism by Shia. So if you're an Orthodox Sunni living in Saudi Arabia in the 1970s, as bin Laden was, the fact that his mother was an Alawite, that might also help explain why he turned to this ultra-Orthodox Sunni fundamentalism. It's interesting the role of his mother in his life, and that makes me think. One of the things I was really struck by in your book, at a moment when one was reading about the Taliban coming back into Afghanistan and shutting down public spaces for women and education for women, the extent to which Osama bin Laden himself was reliant upon and drew upon the learning and wisdom of women in his life. So his mother, but also, two of his wives who had doctorates, PhDs. And relying on them for ideas, for counsel, for drafting his speeches. Could you talk about that?
Well, we known that his oldest wife, Hamza, the mother of Hamza, was 8 years older than bin Laden. She was 62 when he was killed. He was 54. She'd had an independent career in Saudi Arabia as a teacher of deaf-mute children. She had a PhD in child psychology. She was a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, which was a big deal for bin Laden. 3 of his wives claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad. And then his other wife, Sihan, also claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad. She had a doctorate in Quranic grammar. She was a poet. She edited his speeches. So, this is surprising. I think it might be surprising for people who are listening to this that he had 2 highly educated wives, because you think of it, in the sense, the project that for him, the Taliban were the closest thing to an ideal society. So he certainly didn't have any vision of women having any role outside of the house. But he was highly reliant on them. And one of the discoveries that came out of the documents from the compound in Abbottabad, one of the key documents that was only released at the end of 2017 was a bin Laden family journal. So they knew it was a 228-page journal, handwritten in Arabic, and it's sort of hard to interpret. Nadia Waidat, a colleague of mine in America, who's a leading scholar of Islamist thought, helped interpret it for me. And then it wasn't intended for public consumption. It's essentially family notes about their discussions. And his 2 oldest wives, his 2 oldest daughters, and his oldest son met every night before dinner and after dinner to discuss the events of the Arab Spring, because bin Laden was very concerned about the fact his ideas, his followers were not involved in it. He was trying to take control of the Arab Spring. They all had this delusion that if he delivered this big speech, that he would be able to take charge of the Arab Spring and kind of direct it. His big idea was that he would deliver a speech calling for a council of religious scholars, who would be all Taliban-style scholars, to guide the revolutionaries and guide the new governments in the Middle East. Now, no one was asking for this. No one really wanted to hear what bin Laden had to say. But so as you say, he was very reliant on his older wives to help him write his speeches, do his thinking. Hamza, the oldest wife who I mentioned, had actually been living under house arrest in Iran for almost a decade after 9/11. She suddenly reappeared in his life. He started writing her these love letters. As she's traveling from Iran to Pakistan, she shows up on February 15th, 2011. And that's when they really begin seriously thinking about what to say about these revolutions that had begun in January. And bin Laden had some other concerns at the time. He was very worried about the 2 bodyguards who were looking after him. After 10 years of looking after him, they told him, we're planning to leave. This was a big problem because they did everything for him, whether it was picking up books for him to read or sending messages to other people in Al-Qaeda, protecting him. But the relationship had become very strained. And it became so strange that on January 15th, 2011, bin Laden wrote them both a letter. Now, this would be like me writing my wife a letter. Everybody was living together on the same compound. And, but bin Laden said, I want to put in writing our agreement because last time we met, we were all so angry. And the agreement was they would all leave. Bin Laden and his family would leave the compound in July 2011. His bodyguards would leave, and he'd have to find new protectors. So he had a lot in the final weeks of his life. He had a lot kind of weighing on his mind. Also, that he hadn't attacked the United States again, which he was very concerned about. Also, the impending 10th anniversary of 9/11, which he was planning to use as a time to relaunch Al-Qaeda. Over time, he did become very concerned about the issue of Muslim civilians being killed by groups in Al-Qaeda or groups allied to it. And he was going to relaunch Al-Qaeda as a group that went out of its way not to kill Muslim civilians. So that was these were the kind of things that were weighing on his mind the last weeks of his life.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned this compound he had in Abbottabad, which was, this idea that he was a kind of lone fugitive living completely in isolation is of course not true at all. It was 27 people on this compound. It was a kind of running large household, if not several households. And one of the things that many people have thought was, how the hell could the Pakistan military and intelligence not have known that he was there? This is not a hard to see target. as it were.
Yeah.
And you're quite emphatic in the book that there was no support or connection between Pakistan authorities of any kind and bin Laden. I mean, can you just sort of explain that a bit? Because obviously, in India, there's a lot of anger and concern about that issue.
Yeah. Well, and particularly because the compound was a mile or so from Pakistan's main military academy. So people say, well, how could they not have known? Well, people, I was on Bosnian television, somebody asked me the same question. I said, how long did it take to find Karadzic, who was one of the great war criminals of the Bosnian Civil War? And it turns out it was 15 years. I didn't know the answer. And he was living, pretty openly, I think, in Belgrade. But when I say openly, he was, he hadn't left the country. So the reason I mention that example is that it took the Israelis until 1962 to find Eichmann, despite the fact they really wanted to find him. So, if you're being pretty careful, you can disappear. And bin Laden was being pretty careful. No internet, no phone service, only communicating with messages that were hand carried by couriers. Now, he did have, as you say, 27 people living on this compound. He had 12 of his kids and grandkids, 3 of his wives, the 2 bodyguards and their families. So it's a lot of people now. They were actually running a small farm, essentially, because they were trying to avoid going out. So they had cows and chickens. But I would say 2 or 3 things. One, there was a lot of narrative after he was killed that this compound really stuck out. It didn't. I visited it. There are lots of people with compounds with high walls in northern Pakistan. There are lots of people who have their wives sort of living in Purdah and don't really come out and aren't really. And when the CIA looked at this, there were a lot of alternative explanations. Was this guy a drug dealer who was hiding there? Was he somebody in Al-Qaeda who retired? Was he a lower level member of Al-Qaeda? Certainly he was hiding. But he was hiding even from people on his own compound. One of the bodyguard's wives didn't know it was bin Laden that was hiding on the compound. Bin Laden, and then we had these documents. Now, if let's say bin Laden was in touch with a Pakistani official or military officer, he generated 6,000 pages of useful documents from the many files that were recovered. And, they cover everything about it. It was 5.5 years of everything he thought or wrote about. His letters to his family, his letters to members of Al-Qaeda, leaders of Al-Qaeda, leaders of other groups, letters to the Taliban. If he had some sort of protector, there's no documentary evidence for this. And, documentary evidence isn't everything, but I think he had a lot of time on his hands. He generated a vast amount of paper. And so there's nothing in there. And the Pakistanis themselves, actually one of the key documents I used in the book. So there was actually an Abbottabad commission that was run by 4 fairly senior retired Pakistani military judges, civil servants. And that commission, the report was leaked by Al Jazeera in 2014. The report is very, very critical of the Pakistani government on 2 grounds. One, that they didn't know that bin Laden was there. 2, that they had such a feckless response to the US military raid the night that bin Laden was killed. And I kind of take they interviewed 200 witnesses. It's a pretty good piece of work. It's publicly available for anybody who's interested. And again, there's nothing in that indicates that anybody in Pakistan knew where he was. And there's one final point about this, because the Cy Hirsch, the investigative journalist, has written a whole thing in the London Review of Books about how the Pakistanis and the Americans both knew he was there. It was all set up. Well, there's nothing in that 10,000 word piece that's true, except that bin Laden was killed. It's all. Some people, it's very hard to prove negatives, but there is no evidence. And no one, by the way, has come forward. You could make, if you were, let's say you were the ISI officer in charge of the bin Laden account, and you're now retired, you could make a lot of money by publishing your account of what it was to be, that has not happened because there's nothing there.
Yeah. No, I think, one of the things that's so impressive about the book is how meticulous you are about using documents and exploding some of the myths and rumors that have surrounded this figure across time. I should also say you have an amazingly gripping account of the actual operation to kill bin Laden. It's a beautifully told account. Let's pull back a bit now, and back to where we are today in the region, Afghanistan, and what it might mean, particularly as you were saying, for the near neighbors, which in a sense have most to worry about at this stage. And what China is obviously the big new player in a way that it wasn't 20 years ago or 25 years ago when the Soviets and the Russians and then the Americans were involved in Afghanistan. And what do you see on that horizon, the kind of role that China might play, and what space does it leave for India, for instance, in acting in the region?
What's fascinating about all this, Sunil, is that the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and the Pakistanis are all, I think, pretty happy that there isn't a large American presence in Afghanistan. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword because they may not be, the fact that Taliban have completely taken over poses each one of those countries a problem. You may recall in 1999, Iran almost went to war with the Taliban because the Taliban had killed 9 Iranian diplomats. It was a pretty serious rift. And of course, here you have a Sunni fundamentalist regime on the border of a Shia fundamentalist regime. So they're not natural allies. The Chinese are obsessed by the Uyghurs, in a way, which is, obsession is too small a word for what they're, and of course there have been Uyghur militants living in Afghanistan. The Russians have their own problem with Islamist terrorists, and they've got former Russian republics, the former Soviet republics bordering Afghanistan. Pakistan had a huge problem with the Pakistani Taliban, actually went to war against them and conducted a lot of tens of thousands of Pakistanis have died as a result of Pakistani Taliban and other attacks, whether it's military or civilians. So each one of these countries has, they're really happy that the United States no longer has Bagram Air Base, which was the largest, one of the largest bases, American bases in the world, close to China, close to Iran, close to Russia. But I think that the Taliban, it can blow back on them in different ways. Now, when it comes to India, of course, Pakistan and China have the same goal in Afghanistan, which is to exclude India from any kind of role, and that they've got. The Taliban are. We talked about how they've forced the Hindu minority to wear distinctive clothing before 9/11. I don't think there's no scenario in which the Taliban are sort of going to be close to India. I just don't see that. But you mentioned China. I think China may be the first country to recognize the Taliban. Once China has, Pakistan doesn't want to go first because it's sort of like there's a reputational cost, I think, for them. But if China recognizes them, Russia recognizes them, both of which are possible. And the other player that I'd add, which is new, is Qatar. Qatar was a non-player when the Taliban were last in power. When the Taliban were last in power, it was Pakistan, UAE, and Saudi that recognized them. I think this time around, UAE and Saudi may not recognize them because the Saudi has banned the Muslim Brotherhood and in fact describes it as a terrorist organization. If the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization, what does that make the Taliban? So I think under MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, I think it would be, I don't see the Saudis rushing to recognize the Taliban. And since the UAE and the Saudis tend to have the same foreign policy, I don't see that either. I do see the Qataris potentially recognizing it. They already de facto have. And the Qataris can play a very good role. They're getting people out who want to get out. The United States has this diplomatic presence on Afghanistan. It's now in Doha. 15 years ago it would have been Islamabad, but that's not happening. So in terms of the region, I think those are the countries that are going to kind of will recognize the Taliban.
But with let's say China or the Qataris or some of the others who are moving closer or to recognize it, what are the sort of levers that they might have over the Taliban? What ways can they actually check or control any actions they might take?
The Chinese have. I think if the Taliban do what China wants on the Uyghur issue, the Chinese will be very happy about that. The Chinese have, as you know, this huge copper mine, which they've never really exploited because because the Taliban surrounded it, so it was never exploitable. But now that the Taliban control the country, it might be more exploitable. So the Chinese have a great need for rare earth minerals, and Afghanistan is rife with these rare earth minerals. They're not easy to extract, but the Chinese could help them. So, and of course, China borders Afghanistan literally, and they have the new Silk Road, and Afghanistan was part of the old Silk Road. So, I mean, there could be and of course, Pakistan, China's put a huge amount of money into the Gwadar port on the Arabian Sea in southern Pakistan, and has put a lot of money into Pakistan for the new Silk Road. So Afghanistan could easily be part of that for the Chinese, as long as the Chinese play ball, as long as the Taliban play ball on the Uyghur issue. I think China. So, and China doesn't care. China's foreign policy, I don't think, is really wrapped up in the question of human rights. So, and of course, the Chinese also have very few allies, and one of their closest allies, and one of their few allies, is Pakistan. Pakistan also has very few allies, and the Chinese are one of them. So that is a pretty comfortable arrangement: China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Russia. Certainly, it's not a coincidence that a lot of these Taliban negotiations took place in Moscow. I mean, I think the Russians certainly have they are not unsympathetic to the Taliban, and then as I mentioned, the Qataris, and the Qataris can play really. I think there is a bond around Islam that is not insignificant, right? And particularly if it's a Sunni state, and Qatar is one of those, and I think there are also Taliban peace negotiations took place in Doha. So I think that's what the future will hold, is those countries recognizing the Taliban over time.
So one more question, and then we'll open it up to participants. And I guess it'll be interesting to just hear you reflect on the sort of method and nature of investigating a subject like this. This is 30 years ago, I think, almost, since you first went to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
This has not been the easiest subject to try and gain reliable knowledge on.
Yeah.
And as a journalist, as a researcher, as a scholar, and even now as a historian of this period, what have you found out about the kinds of methods and techniques that one can use to navigate this world of secrecy and conspiracy and rumor and so on?
Well, that's a great question, and I owe some of my success in this area to you, because you pointed me to a job at Johns Hopkins. I spent 4 years teaching there. I didn't have any exposure to the academy, and I didn't really understand the world of the academy, and I come out of a documentary journalism background, and I sort of fell into the story because of the Trade Center attack in '93. A lot of the people involved in that, they tried to bring down both towers. They blew up a bomb in the car park in the basement of the building. In the end, they killed only 6 people, but this was the beginning of this phenomenon, particularly for the United States, of people who were in bin Laden's orbit attacking American targets. And so I just, I went to Afghanistan in '93, then I went in '97 again to meet bin Laden, interview him for CNN as part of a team. Left CNN, wrote my first book, didn't have a clue about how to write a book. Finished it a week before 9/11. It needed a huge amount of reframing because of the 9/11 events, and it was a very badly written piece of, I had never written a book before, so it had a lot of problems. But so what have I learned? One thing I do like is documents. Because documents are not the whole story. You can never get the whole story because it doesn't exist. But documents tend not to lie, particularly not documents that were not intended for public consumption. And they tend to have better memories than humans, which our memories are fallible, and we tend to put ourselves in the best light. We don't remember things in the way that a contemporaneous document does. So what have I learned? One great thing about television in the pre-social media days is you had to actually go and get people to talk on camera. Social media has actually made it's given the illusion that you understand everybody because everybody's sort of on social media, but you can't really have a confrontational interview with somebody. And when I say confrontational, I don't mean coming to blows, but you can't like elicit and react in the same way. And so social media has at once given us a lot more information about the world, but it's much more partial. And I mean that in all the different ways: partial, incomplete, partial, partisan. So, I was lucky enough to meet some of the people in the Laden's circle. I met a lot in the book I've just written is built on a long time of reporting. I met with a lot of bin Laden's friends and associates and family members, many of whom are now dead or in prison, and so they're not. So I thought it was important on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 to write this book, particularly since I'm teaching students who weren't born on 9/11. For them, 9/11 is history. I mean, it's like the Korean War is for me. It's like something obviously, it's unlike the Korean War. 9/11 continues to have reverberations. That when the Korean War came to the armistice happened, it didn't have further resonance in quite the same way. But I don't think I've learned anything particularly. I've learned more because I've met more people, read more documents, and have become a better writer and a better researcher, which is really just about practice. I mean, because I don't think.
And the sort of triangulation of evidence across documents, interviews.
Well, that's also true. That's also true. Yeah.
It's very much there. Okay, I'm just going to end now, and we will take questions. But you mentioned at the beginning the one of the positive things that had happened in the last 20 years was the development of the free press in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And today the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, has gone to two journalists, which is a wonderful thing.
One of them is Maria Ressa, who was my old CNN colleague, who actually wrote a great book about Jamaat Islamiyah, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Indonesia. Right. So, and she did a lot of reporting, and it's great that she's got this award. She's an amazing human being.
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, I think it's a fantastic day for journalism and for the free press. And the Pulitzer Board has just given $100,000 to Afghan journalists working in Afghanistan who escaped. But what is your prospect for the future of a free press in Afghanistan? And because clearly you have also relied on on the availability of people speaking freely and journalists and so on in Afghanistan. And is that something that you fear the loss of? Down at the blinds?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting question because I think there's a lot of very good journalism coming out of Afghanistan right now. The Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, but that's all the Western press. See, the Taliban, right for the moment, are not interfering with that. Mm-hmm. But for the Afghan press, I think it's a very different matter. I mean, I can't remember the number, but at least 100 Afghan media outlets have ceased production. And maybe it's hard for me to tell if that's sort of kind of a self-censorship or the Taliban closing them down or their economic model suddenly isn't viable. I did an event for the American University of Afghanistan a couple of nights ago. Tom Freston, who is on the board of New America, where we are, he was instrumental in getting Tolo TV off the ground, which is run by Saad Masseni, who's an amazing guy. And Tolo is still on the air. They have, but they're engaging in a certain amount of self-censorship. There's certain things that the Taliban want them to do, which they're not doing yet. And, the Taliban can, for the moment, Tolo TV is on the air. That's a good thing because it's the main source of news. It's very independent. But it's not the same Tolo that existed before the Taliban took over, and some of their journalists have left. And as you probably remember, Tolo TV has lost, something like a dozen employees who've been killed by the Taliban. So they have good reason to be concerned, and they are concerned. I think they have plan Bs for what to do in the future. And the world is, there wasn't a phone system in Afghanistan when I was there under the Taliban. I mean, forget about the internet. And now, there is a very high degree of cell phone coverage. So it's going to be hard for the Taliban to impose, when they were in charge pre-9/11, there was only one media outlet. It was Radio Sharia, which, as you can imagine, wasn't particularly.
Not for your morning news. Yeah.
Positive. So that is going to be a hard genie to put back in the bottle. But I mean, one thing is, look, if you rule like Stalin, you know, think about Saudi Arabia now under Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, dissent of any kind is non-existent because they run a very efficient police state, and the Taliban could do that even and keep. So we'll see.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, let's open that up to questions now. We're going to read these. Just give us a moment while we. I think we're going to read it off the screen here. And so let's see.
Seeing more teams. I mean, actually,
Okay. Well, we'll thanks, Peter. We'll take them off the chat. And so one of the questions that has come up is, you know, how was bin Laden able to have the influence that he did over so many people? What was the you know, why was he not seen through for what he was? How did he become this?
Well, one way to answer that is if you're in Munich in 1920, in the early 20s, and you saw Hitler in a beer cellar, sort of ranting and raving in front of 4 people, you'd say, how did this person suddenly influence tens of millions of people to think of him as a great leader, and to follow him into these wars that destroyed Germany? So. I think charisma is in the eye of the beholder, and I've seen, I met bin Laden, albeit briefly. He didn't strike me as being particularly charismatic, but for the people who followed him, and I try and get into this in the book, they describe feelings of love for him. Love is a pretty strong kind of feeling. So for those who, bin Laden's spoke a very classical Arabic. He had this interesting backstory of fighting the Soviets, even though he came from this very wealthy family. For some, he was an inspirational figure. He wasn't, but over time his popularity has faded. After 9/11, he had a kind of a little bit of a Robin Hood image. But I think since 9/11, his when Gallup or others sort of polled, his poll numbers gradually went down and down. And I think there was a simple reason for that. Suicide bombing, which was Al-Qaeda's signature technique, had killed so many Muslims in Iraq and Pakistan and other places. And I think people, over time, just the kind of romantic image around bin Laden sort of began to evaporate. And by the time he was killed, I think he was a pretty marginal figure.
So here's an interesting question again about bin Laden's own life and career. I mean, you met him first when he was not the kind of world famous figure.
Yeah.
He didn't have the notoriety that he subsequently got. Was there, I mean, looking back at his life, do you think there was something like a turning point when he took a direction which, in a sense, led?
I mean, I think there were a few turning points. One was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. He voted with his feet and his money and went there. Then he set up his own military base, which was another turning point in Afghanistan in 1987. Then he set up Al-Qaeda in 1988, which was really devoted to, it wasn't really anti-American at its inception. It was more about, we've got all these people trained from the Soviet war. We're going to get involved in other jihads. And for bin Laden, the first jihad that he was going to get involved with was fighting the then Marxist government of southern Yemen, which in the end didn't happen. So, and then Saddam invaded Kuwait, 500,000 American troops in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden thought that was against Islam. Then he, became essentially a critic of the Saudi royal family because of their alliance with the United States. He was exiled to Sudan. He began plotting against the United States there. Then he was re-exiled to Afghanistan in 1996. Each one of these steps along the way turned him in a more radical direction. And if one of those steps if you took away one or two of those steps, I think he wouldn't have become the person he was. So it was really a bunch of outside circumstances allied to his own kind of understanding of the world. And then one other final point is that bin Laden had a strategic conception, which is that on 9/11, he would attack the United States, and the United States would pull out of the Middle East. This was a very bad strategic conception because it's not what actually happened. But it was his way or the highway, and he ran Al-Qaeda. It wasn't a democratic institution. And there was internal opposition to attacking the United States, either because the United States would react in ways that would be very damaging, or that it would be bad for the Taliban, or that it was against Islam. There were a bunch of people inside Al-Qaeda saying these things to bin Laden, and he ignored them. So there were definitely places that he could have, there were off-ramps or outside events that happened that turned him in a more radical direction. But also at the end of the day, there was his own tremendous self-belief in his own views, which, most people, I don't think have that level of, he truly believed all these things that were sort of delusional about what would happen after 9/11.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that sense of the political contingency combined with this self delusion, as you put it. And one of the questions that's come up is, do you have any sense of whether he had a specific view or conception of the South Asian region, of the Pakistani state, of, let's say, the issue in Kashmir, or the issue, the presence of India as a figure in his kind of universe of how the kind of world he wanted it to be?
Well, I think Kashmir was one on a long list of grievances that bin Laden had. Bosnia during the 90s, Kashmir, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At the end of the day, bin Laden was a Saudi, so he was focused on Saudi, even to the exclusion of other issues like Egypt, which Ayman al-Zawahiri, the present leader of Al-Qaeda, was from. Bin Laden didn't really pay much attention to the Egyptian issue. But Kashmir was certainly one of a long list of grievances that bin Laden had. And when you ask about Pakistan, Al-Qaeda tried to kill General Musharraf on 2 occasions, if you recall, in sort of 2003, 2004 time period. So certainly bin Laden saw the Pakistani state as an enemy. And there's, going back to one of your original questions about, was there a relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Pakistanis and bin Laden? Not at all. In fact, the Pakistanis handed over members of Al-Qaeda, leaders of Al-Qaeda, to the United States when they were hiding in Pakistani cities in the years after 9/11, which is one of the reasons they went to the tribal regions as a way to kind of escape that. So I think the Kashmir issue was important. And Lashkar-e-Taiba has pretty close relationship with Al-Qaeda. An example of that is Abu Zubaydah, who was the first Al-Qaeda leader of any note, who was captured after 9/11, was living in a Lashkar-e-Taiba safe house in Pakistan. So these groups are somewhat linked. And David Coleman Headley, who carried out the attacks in Mumbai, he was closely linked with Al-Qaeda, with Lashkar-e-Taiba, but he also dealt with people in Al-Qaeda. You may recall that he seriously considered attacking.
I'm not sure I understand.
He seriously considered attacking the Danish newspaper that would publish the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, in addition to doing all the other things that he did. And he did that partly because it was a bin Laden issue, and he had communications with people in Al-Qaeda.
On Al-Qaeda and its future, we mentioned earlier that the interior minister in Afghanistan has connections, possibly is a member of Al-Qaeda. Do you see it as having a kind of renewed life now in the region, and what kind of threat might it be able to pose today?
Yeah, well, there's this kind of relatively new group called Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, AQIS, and it's devoted to Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. I think that that group is surely going to benefit from the Taliban being in charge of Afghanistan. What it means, does it mean that it's going to be attacks in India by Al-Qaeda? I don't know. But clearly the situation has changed sufficiently so that this is good for the jihadists. I mean, if we'd had this conversation a year ago, I would have been much more, Al-Qaeda is essentially done. It's really very limited capacity to carry out attacks. But this great victory for the jihadists, there was 3 great victories. One was the expulsion of the Soviets from Afghanistan. 2 was 9/11. 3 is this Taliban takeover, because they have an entire state that is really run under the, they believe that when I asked people in Al-Qaeda, what do you think of the Taliban? They were like, well, it's probably the government that we think is living closest to the precepts of Islam that we believe in.
So one of the questions that's come in is the nature of the kind of anti-Americanism that bin Laden had, and how, given that it was American support that for the Mujahideen that had led to the expulsion of the Soviets in Afghanistan, why was there this turn against America? Well,
that's a good question. And one of the kind of conspiracy theories that is not true is that the CIA was helping bin Laden. And bin Laden didn't need CIA help. The agency was not. They didn't really know who bin Laden was and his followers until the first time they really recognized that he might be a problem was 3-4 years after the anti-Soviet war was over. But why did bin Laden turn against the United States? Well, one, his father, Mohammed bin Laden, had renovated the Dome of the Rock in 1968, 1967, which is the 3rd holiest site in Islam. And so for bin Laden, he was chanting religion. When he was a teenager, he would get friends to his house and they would chant religious songs about Palestine. So even as a teenager, bin Laden was very concerned about the Palestinian issue, as a result of which he became very anti-American, because he blamed the United States for its support for Israel for the plight of the Palestinians. And he, as early as 1986, was delivering speeches in mosques and gathering places, calling for a boycott of the United States, a boycott of American goods. So he was anti-American for a long time. It was with once the United States put 500,000 troops into Saudi Arabia as a result of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iraq, that turned his sort of anti-Americanism into real hatred of the United States. So that was kind of the process.
Another question that's coming up is, what is it that is what drives people into terrorism? I mean, this is a very large.
Well, it's a great question. It's a great question.
Yeah, but are there any? I mean, having thought about it, are there any kind of broad generalizations that you think are useful?
Well, there's some academic literature around this. It's why do people embrace extremism? Well, sometimes the death of a parent, the loss of a job, the sense that Muslims are under attack. There are kind of cognitive openings that might take you to. So people have looked at this in why do people turn to Muslim extremism in the West, and typically second generation, not very observant, and death of a parent, loss of a job, Muslims are under attack. That can provide a cognitive opening to becoming more fundamentalist, which of course being a fundamentalist doesn't make you necessarily extremist at all. But then, a small minority may embrace kind of more extremist views, and it really then it becomes like a cult, because what cults do is you tend to get married inside the cult. So often, an Islamist militant will marry somebody who has the same sort of views, which interestingly in the UK, often you're forced to marry cousins if you're from a particular like Kashmiri background, and the second generation don't marry their cousin. They sometimes marry somebody who holds extreme religious views, and then a even smaller minority will turn to violence, and that is why that is there's no easy answer to that. The FBI has a very interesting kind of answer to this question, which is they didn't really look at the why you become somebody who's going to conduct an act of violence. They really look at the how, because there's something called the pathway to violence that anybody who's going to kill somebody tends to go down. But obviously, the crimes of passion, but like there's a 6-stage path that the FBI looks at. And the question is, how far down it are you? And are there things that are maybe going to inhibit you going down the path? So inhibitors from acting out, murdering somebody as a planned murder would include having a job, having a wife and kids, having a sort of, resolving issues without violence. Those are the inhibitors. The pathway to violence begins with grievance. Grievance is unresolved. You would then have ideation about how you might solve it. Then you begin research about how you might approach, killing somebody. You might even go through rehearsals, and then you carry out the act of violence. And the good thing about this pathway to violence way of looking at things is it's really agnostic about ideology, because somebody who's a right-wing extremist who's going to kill somebody because they're a racist is going to do exactly the same thing that a jihadi terrorist is. So that's the way the FBI looks at it. They try and be agnostic about ideology. Of course, in this country, we have the First Amendment. You're entitled to have any views you want, and you don't want to get involved in kind of policing thought crimes, etc. So, but who becomes a terrorist and why is a really interesting question. Often they're middle class. Peter bin Laden is the son of a multi-millionaire, billionaire. Ayman al-Zawahiri comes from a very prominent family in Egypt. They're not the dispossessed. Usually, if you're very poor, you're too busy trying to make ends to meet to get engaged in a kind of violent group and go to the meetings. And so typically, terrorists have been middle class. I mean, that was true of the Manhunt gang in Germany, the Weather Underground in the United States. And that's certainly true of Al-Qaeda.
And often quite educated and often family. I mean, they're not necessarily all loners. I mean,
No.
Bin Laden himself was obviously a family man in many ways. But so what seems to be happening now? America has really moved its attention in terms of the national security apparatus from terrorism to now China as the big intelligence object of concern. And how does that make you feel about how well prepared we're going to be for the years ahead across the world?
Well, I think the United States can walk and chew gum at the same time. I mean, they're not either or categories. And I mean, President Biden has sort of presented the pullout of Afghanistan like this, as if we can't keep 2,500 or 3,500 troops there because we have to focus on other threats like China. There are 1.3 million Americans in the active duty military, there are 2 million in the reserves. The idea that we can't keep 2,500 troops is ridiculous. But certainly we had the news in the last 24 hours that the CIA set up this China Mission Center inside the agency to really bring all the kind of expertise together under one roof. And that makes sense. I mean, there's a lot of bipartisan agreement about China as a peer competitor that may want to challenge the United States in lots of different ways. And but that doesn't mean that terrorism is going to go away. And one thing the United States tends to do is the U.S. military and the U.S. national security establishment tends to be very comfortable about whatever the kind of war they want to fight at any given moment. Right now, they don't want to be in these messy, protracted, no resolution wars in the Middle East. And in a sense, they're more comfortable thinking about what a war with China might look like. And but the fact is that the messy wars without conclusion keep coming back, and we went back into Iraq in 2014 because of ISIS. We may have something that may bring us back into Afghanistan. President Kamala Harris or President Marco Rubio or even President Biden may say, "Hey, we need to go back into Afghanistan." But certainly, some of the Chinese operations around Taiwan raise real concerns, and will the United States, there was a discussion around in the US Senate now about do we abandon the sort of strategic ambiguity we have about Taiwan?
Right.
And but is there a universe in which the United States will get into a war with China over Taiwan? I'm not entirely convinced. So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions that's come in is about bin Laden after his death. His body was thrown into the sea. But the question there being, was he seen as, and does he still continue to be a threat after his death?
Well, I mean, I think his end was very unheroic. He died in a squalid suburban compound surrounded by his wives and kids. He didn't reach for, he had 2 weapons in his room, he didn't reach for them. I think the unheroic end, if you look at the pro-bin Laden demonstrations after he was killed, they were very small. So I think he still remains an inspirational figure for some very small group of people. ISIS continues to see him as sort of an inspirational figure. But for the vast majority of Muslims, I think he's, I think he has disappeared as a significant thinker, role model. And Sunil, you mentioned I went to the Abbottabad compound before it was destroyed. I didn't know it was two weeks later the Pakistani military destroyed it because they didn't want it to become a shrine. And he was buried at sea by the United States for the same reason, which was they didn't want to create some kind of shrine to bin Laden by burying him anywhere. But I think that there'll be, with every generation of new jihadis, he'll be kind of an important thinker. But I think I end the book with one of the first people to really kind of recognize the threat from bin Laden was this analyst, Gina Bennett. And she says, a very junior analyst says, when bin Laden was killed, this must have been a terrible day for Al-Qaeda. And she asked this junior analyst, do you know what the Baader-Meinhof gang is? And the junior analyst says, no, I don't. Well, back in the 70s, the Baader-Meinhof gang were a really big deal because they were killing senior leaders in Germany routinely. And now they're completely forgotten almost entirely. And Gina Bennett's point was, bin Laden over time will be forgotten, and when he really loses will be is when he's not a subject of any kind of public discussion. I don't think that's going to be that might take some period of time, but somebody reminded me that President McKinley, President of the United States, was killed by an anarchist in 1901. And the name of that anarchist I've forgotten, but clearly that anarchist, after President McKinley, that would have been a household name. So over time, terrorist groups, they tend to fade because they don't achieve their goals, or if they do, and sometimes in rare cases, they achieve their goals and then they become part of the political process. So Sinn Féin, was part of the IRA, is now part of the political process in Northern Ireland because they achieve their goals. But usually terrorists don't achieve their goals. They because of that, they get wiped out by the government, or they no longer have any popular support. And so, I don't think bin Laden's going to be a trivial pursuit question a century from now, but I do think that he will just fade from relevance. Right.
Well, yeah, I guess that was what was happening until a few weeks ago.
Well, I think that's exactly right. We're in a huge new. That's why a year ago, if we had this conversation, I would have been. This thing has just had a new iteration, but it won't go on forever. It might take 5 years, but ISIS was a new iteration. The Iraq War was a new iteration. Now we have the Taliban in charge of Afghanistan. I think that is a new iteration.
One issue that's come up is, in this long battle against this particular variety of terrorism, and as you noted, we should also remember there are many different types of terrorism. It's not just Islamist terrorism that the world faces. But in this particular battle, how has it changed the states that have been fighting these battles?
Well, the United States is definitely different. Just from go to the airport now,
Right.
And also, I mean, you can draw a direct line from 9/11 to President Trump, I think. It's a dotted line, because if you go back to the campaign with Hillary Clinton, ISIS was at its height. ISIS terrorists had killed 49 people in Orlando, Florida. They killed 14 people in San Bernardino, California. They killed 130 people in Paris. Americans were more concerned about terrorism during that campaign than they've been since 9/11, because it was very front and center. It was all these news stories. And and Trump had a really simple answer to this, which was a Muslim travel ban. And half of Americans thought that was a good idea. Half of Americans of any political persuasion, 80% of Republicans, almost anybody who voted for Trump in the primary. So, 9/11 not only had some of the, we talked about at the beginning, the various wars and military operations around the Muslim world, but it also had unexpected political consequences in the United States. Because I think it's very hard to see Trump really came on the political stage with this Muslim travel ban, because he was very clever, because Corey Lewandowski, who was then his campaign manager, said, we are not going to get outflanked on immigration by any Republican. Don't forget there were 15 candidates, right, against him. And some of those candidates would say, we can never have a Muslim travel ban. But this was a very simple idea, and like a lot of simple ideas to complex problems, it was actually ridiculous because the people who were carrying out these attacks were American citizens. They were already here. So I do think that it changed America in lots of ways that were unexpected. I mean, and of course, that bin Laden didn't intend. He didn't know what the future would bring. But I do think we're a much more cramped, kind of country than we're now after 9/11. I always think about Trump's mother, Mary Trump, who came from the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, which was probably one of the poorest countries. She came in 1931 to the United States as a domestic servant. She came from one of the poorest places in the planet, the Outer Hebrides, in 1931. And the United States was a country built on immigration, obviously, and it's been very hospitable to immigrants and refugees. And 9/11 turned us against that. And we're seeing that today. Look, even with the Afghan refugees, there was a lot of Republican and Democrats saying we need to do something. But now already you're seeing this thing beginning to turn, and people talking about, well, we don't know how well vetted they are, and they may be terrorists. So I think it's made the United States a much less generous country in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, in that sense, I think your point in the book that this is really bin Laden was a figure who changed the course of world history in many unintended ways as well, is absolutely true.
And I don't want, he's not Napoleon, he's not Hitler, he's not Stalin, he's not Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Winston Churchill or pick your world historical figure, but he did change history. He didn't change history in the completely seismic ways that the various key players in World War II did, but he certainly has changed the world we live in. And as you say, sort of in unexpected ways.
Yeah. Well, Peter, thank you very much for this.
Oh, thank you.
And I think this has kind of given us a real sense both of this particular individual, but also the kind of wider moment and currents that kind of made him. And as you say, I mean, it was this combination of, in a sense, devout, sort of zealous belief, but also political contingencies and the interventions of other states and actors which produced him and led him to act as he did. Just to recommend to our participants again the book by Peter, which has just come out, called The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. It is the best book on this man that you will find, and I do recommend it. As we come to a close, I'll just remind all our participants that we do have a survey poll, and we'd appreciate your filling this in, just so that we can have feedback from you as participants about this session. And it just remains for me to thank Peter Bergen and to thank New America for hosting Ashoka X for this session here today. And to thank Abhilash Rajan at New America for making this happen technically. So Peter, thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Sunil.
And I can only hope that some of the more ominous anxieties that you've expressed about the future today don't all come true, but
Indeed.
we're not here in the prediction business. Great. Well, thanks very much.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you.